Right. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Lesley Jacques, who became a beekeeper by accident when a swarm arrived in her garden in 2011. She has worked her way through all the modules in husbandry exams and became a master beekeeper in 2022. And just 2 years later, she became NDB, which is absolutely excellent. She's a really, really brilliant speaker, and I know you're going to enjoy her topic tonight, which is swarming. Can we keep all the questions until the end? You can put them in the chat, but if you leave them till the end, some of them might have already been answered. So over to you, Lesley. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Diane, for that very kind introduction. Yes, what Diane says is true. I never really intended for any of this to happen. I am an accidental beekeeper, although sometimes you need to make the best of fate. I run about 20 colonies, plus or minus a few. And so I have quite a bit of experience of swarming. And I think, when I first started beekeeping, swarming was one of the things that I found the hardest to get to grips with, and one of the things that I found the most intimidating. So we'll look at a few different aspects of swarming tonight. We'll look at what a swarm actually is and the swarming impulse, the signs of swarm preparations, and what, as beekeepers, we can actually look for to give us an idea of what's going on in the colony. Um, a presentation on swarming wouldn't be complete without some swarm control methods. So there's a couple of tried and tested methods. I like to keep things simple, and there's a few methods that I use, and the few methods that I strategically don't use because I just believe they are too complicated or too prone to failure. There's always the issue, of course, of what we do if we can't find the queen, and not everyone's good at spotting queens. So there's a few hints and tips there, as well as some hints to help make our lives easier, particularly around marking and clipping queens. And a few words at the end about collecting swarms, because that in itself can be a bit of a skill and something of an art. So let's start at the beginning and think about what a swarm actually is. We talk about our bees as being a superorganism. And that means a superorganism, it's the colony that's the functioning entity, not the individual bees. Yes, a bee can exist without the colony as a backup, but probably not for very long. And it's the colony that's the breeding unit. We know that our colonies of bees have only one fertile female, they have the queen. And it's only that queen that produces the sex cells and that can reproduce. So any functioning offspring of the colony has to be able to reproduce itself, and they need their own queen. So how does that actually work? Well, the parent colony with the fertile female queen has to split itself somehow. And it's that splitting of the colony that we know as swarming. A new queen starts to develop. And as that new queen enters pupation, the colony will split. The existing parent colony stays at home, and the old queen will leave with a very good proportion of the flying bees. That swarm issues leaving a new queen in her place. So if you look at it in terms of a child and a parent and an offspring, what we've actually got here, the parent is the pre-existing colony. The offspring is the swarm that issues. So swarming isn't anything mystical, it isn't anything complicated, it's simply a superorganism, a complicated organism reproducing itself in a way that gives a parent colony and a viable offspring. The viable offspring being the swarm that we see, the pile of bees that we see up a tree or in the hedge. Let's have a look at the swarming impulse then and see what kind of things underpin that behaviour. Key to swarming is pheromone. Everything that our bees do is driven by pheromones. It's a pretty smelly existence being a bee. All of their communication is driven by scent, it's driven by vibrations, it's driven by pheromones. And what's really important here is what we know as queen mandibular pheromone, otherwise known as queen substance. You may have heard it referred to as queen substance. The queen produces queen substance, and it has a number of effects on the colony. Queen substance really aids colony cohesion. So it's the thing that actually keeps the colony sticking together. Queen substance also inhibits the the rearing of new queens. It inhibits the development of ovaries in the worker bees. And a younger queen will produce more queen pheromone than an older queen. Lots of things affect the generation of queen pheromone. The genetics of the bee. So some strains are more swarmy than others. We might know, for example, that we see quite a lot of swarmy behaviour in carniolan bees. It's important in the colony that any queen pheromone is amply distributed across the colony so that all the bees know of the presence of their queen. To do that, they need to have free rein to move around, so they need space. If the colony becomes congested, that can impact the distribution of queen pheromone around the colony. So really, we've got some triggers and propensity for swarming, which actually comes down to queen substance or queen pheromone. If there is a lack of queen pheromone, then we will immediately get new queen cells built and the swarming impulse will start. A few other factors that actually will inhibit and that will keep the swarming impulse going. Laying space. If the colony runs out of laying space, this is very much perceived that the colony has grown too big for the space that it's in, and that can precipitate a swarming impulse. The strain of bee is actually really important. Some strains are much more prone to swarm than others. And for those of us who have a number of colonies, we may see some that will develop many, many queen cells, and we may see others that will perhaps only develop a few. Occasionally, a colony may not make swarm preparations in the spring and the summer. Which for the beekeeper is a little bit of respite, but it's not a particularly good quality for that colony to have. It stymies its reproductive ability. And as I say, overcrowding can stop the transfer of queen substance around the colony. So congestion is another contributory factor to swarm preparations. There are other factors, of course, that we don't really have any control over. The weather, the nectar flow, shade, where the colony is sited. Is it in the sun? Is it in the shade? Is it well ventilated? So lots of things that we as beekeepers can control. We can control the amount of laying space that the queen has. We can control the age of the queen. Do we requeen to provide a young queen for the colony? We can control the overcrowding. We cannot control some of those environmental factors, so not everything is something that we can do anything about. Just a word about queen substance so we can see how really variable this is in the colony. If you look at the production of queen substance with age, these data show quite clearly that a young queen, a queen in her first year, will have a certain amount of queen substance that she will create. By her second year, that's actually dropped to about half the amount that you will see from a youthful queen. By the third year, it's dropped by a half again. By the fourth year, it's dropped by a half again. And this underpins the reason why many commercial beekeepers will requeen their colonies in the spring. So they'll provide a young queen for the colony. That young queen generates more queen substance. So the colony is less likely to swarm if there's a young queen in place. So as a beekeeper, what can we do? What do we need to look out for to see whether those colonies are actually thinking about making swarm preparations? It's happening already this year. We're only in the middle of April, and already I'm hearing reports of colonies thinking about swarming. There are a few changes that we can see in the colony that will actually precede any kind of swarming preparation. We might see drone comb being built. We might see the bees preparing for wax building. So if you're lucky, you may be able to see bees exuding wax flakes from the wax mirrors on the underside of the abdomen. When you move the frames, you may see the bees hanging in festoons, such as the picture at the bottom here, which is associated with wax production. And then there are some less ambiguous signs, the development of new queens, so we might see queen cells, and so on in the colony. So as beekeepers, what do we need to look out for and when? the development of drone comb, and possibly even seeing comb built outside of the main brood nest area, really does indicate that the colony's starting to wake up for the spring. The colony's starting to liven up a little bit. These are early signs and they're easy to see. The comb that's being built in the roof space there, that's a really key indicator to me. This is one of my colonies that I need to provide some more space for those bees. They're building wax, they're getting ready for the spring, and if I didn't give them any more space, I'll have a swarming situation on my hands quite quickly. So a few weeks before, when we see drone comb, think ahead, in a few weeks' time, those drones will be mature and that colony might be starting to think about making swarm preparations. Then, of course, we see the queen cells, completely unambiguous. We know as soon as we see queen cells that the bees have made up their mind, swarming time is upon us and we need to do something about it. The queen will swarm on or around the day when that first queen cell is sealed, which is day 8 from the day that the egg is laid. So we know that if we find queen cells in the colony, you've basically got about a week before it all kicks off. If you've got really sharp eyes, if you're really in tune with your bees and the behavior of your bees, you might notice that your queen is looking quite small. The bees will cease feeding the queen. They will feed her less before the swarm issues. They slim the queen down, possibly up to about 30%, which gives her much better readiness for flight. So if you don't see any queen cells, and don't forget, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. But if you spot your queen and think, she's looking a little bit skinny, then perhaps have a proper look through the colony just to see if there's anything else going on. What about prevention versus control? Well, most of us do swarm control, don't we? When swarm preparations are already underway, and if we don't check those swarm preparations or do something about it, then the colony will absolutely swarm. We know what's happening. Control is easy, but we do have to be meticulous. We've got visible signs to work with. We know what state the bees are in. We know how far advanced the queen cells are, for example. On the other hand, prevention is not that straightforward. We're fighting against nature, and nature usually finds a way. So looking at controlling swarming, we'll concentrate on methods of swarm control rather than swarm prevention, because actually this is what the majority of us will do in practice. But first of all, let's ask, why do we need to control swarming? I'm sure there are people who are advocates of very natural beekeeping who think that it's not that important. To my mind, there are quite a lot of reasons why we need to control swarming. Top of that list, we love our bees as beekeepers. We think they're fascinating. We think they're interesting. Not everybody feels that way. Not everybody loves bees. My neighbours are not really very keen on bees. And they would be less than pleased if I peppered their gardens with random swarms on a regular basis. They consider that to be a nuisance. So, I owe it to the people who live close to my apiaries to not allow that to happen. If a swarm issues and we don't have control of that swarm, well, there could be a subsequent cost to property owners. Bees are cavity nesting creatures. Cavities in walls, underneath soffits, in roof spaces, in chimneys. That can be an absolutely perfect nest site for a bee. And if a swarm moves in, it can cause problems, particularly in working chimneys, which are a bit of a favourite. Removal is costly and it can be difficult. We have a duty of care to our bees. Bees are classed as livestock. They're a living, breathing entity. And as such, I think it is important that we look after those bees and give them the best hope possible. There's the honey crop. Some of us work our bees specifically to generate a honey crop, and letting a swarm issue will compromise that. It will also compromise your ability to control the breeding and the lineage of your bees if you allow your best breeder queen to make off up the lane with a swarm of bees. So retaining the stock and lineage is important to some of us as well. It's worth just having a quick look at what the effect of a swarm is on honey yield, and I think this can be a little bit underestimated. If you look at the size, the colony population, say per 1,000 bees across the year, so our x-axis here are the months of the year, the y-axis is the population of bees in the colony by 1,000 bees. So at the peak of the summer, we might be about 50,000 bees. The peak nectar flow for the majority of people is between sort of June and early August. But this is what happens if a swarm issues at the end of April, beginning of May time. The colony will never really recover the numbers that it's lost. And the bees that it loses, they take stores with them. The reduced colony population won't ever actually replace the foraging force. So as a consequence, we lose the honey that the bees take with them when they swarm, but we also lose the foraging force that will be able to make up that amount. So the honey yield that we can expect is going to be massively reduced. A few interesting swarm facts and figures. Will the swarm take the honey with them? Absolutely they will, both in the swarm and in terms of what they're able to actually collect. Bees generally, when they're foraging, they'll contain about 10 to 20 milligrams of honey. A swarming bee might be carrying 36 milligrams of honey. So she does take enough with her to actually keep her and her fellow bees going. What about the chances of survival of wild swarms if we don't monitor our bee swarming behaviour and perform that duty of care? The chances of survival, if a swarm doesn't find a suitable nest site, are really very low. And if you look at some of Tom Seeley's work that he did in the Arnott Forest, only about 20 to 30% of colonies that swarmed survived if they weren't provided with a suitable nest cavity. The Arnott Forest is very rural. If you look at urban environments where there more be better nest cavities, then the chances are improved a little bit, but still that colony has to establish itself. It has to build the infrastructure of the nest and has to start doing so in good time to be able to survive and build up for the winter. It's a tough call. The survival rates aren't great. And we lose quite a lot of bees. Research estimates have said anywhere between 50 to 70%. So that's, if you think about that in monetary terms, as beekeepers, we lose half of our stock. If you were a sheep farmer, you would be less than pleased if you lost half of your flock every year, and you wouldn't be prepared to let that happen. So as beekeepers, perhaps we ought to think along those lines. Just looking at the proportion of bees leaving with a prime swarm, there's a number of different bits of research that have been done, and I think these data are quite sobering, because they're showing us that anywhere between sort of 68 and 75% of bees will leave with the first swarm. The average is 72% of worker bees. That's actually a huge quantity. Don't forget what's left behind are the young bees and the brood and so on, which will hatch, which will emerge quickly and will make up the numbers, but it never actually makes up the foraging force to the extent that we've lost. So hopefully, we can see that there's some good reasons there to be doing some kind of swarm control to be able to keep on top of our bees. So let's have a look at a couple of swarm control methods that we can use in small scale beekeeping. Obviously, larger scale beekeeping, perhaps different techniques will be used. But for most beekeepers, there's a couple of techniques here that really should be adequate. We need to think about what elements we've got in a honeybee colony. And let's divide that into 3 separate units. We've got the queen. We've got the flying bees, the foragers, and we've got the home bees. We've got the nurse bees and the brood. Now, if you look at a natural swarm, we know to a certain extent that flying bees and queen will depart with the swarm. Yes, there's a little bit of mix-up. We get some younger bees moving with the swarm as well, but on the whole, we can take this as a simple model that the flying bees and the queen will depart with a swarm. The very young bees and the brood remain with the parent colony. Most methods of swarm control rely on separating these components that will either prevent the colony from swarming or they will put the colony into the same state that you would see after a swarm. We'll look at two simple methods. We'll look at a simple artificial swarm, which separates the queen and the flying bees from the brood and the nurse bees. So we take out two of those factions. And we'll also look at taking out a nucleus colony. This is my method of choice because I find it's more straightforward. And that separates the queen from the flying bees. So let's have a look at a packed and artificial swarm. This is the method of swarm control, the one that we're actually taught, isn't it, when we first start beekeeping. Looking at the site that we've got some big animations here, so I hope that it works. Looking at the site that we've got, let's say we have a single colony with a super on the top. We've gone through that colony and we find on one of the frames in the center a queen cell. So that's enough to say, yeah, the girls are thinking about making swarm preparations. What do we do to put that swarm control method into action? Well, first of all, prepare a new site. Just a couple of meters away will be adequate. And that new site should be furnished with a clean floor, and separately make sure that you've got a new brood box and plenty of frames with foundation. We should then move the parent colony across to the new site. Might be a bit of a two-man job if it's a heavy colony. And strip out all but one of the open queen cells. You choose one good quality queen cell in which you can see a nice fat larva on a good sized pool of royal jelly. So there goes the colony moving over onto the new site. We put the new brood box complete with frames of foundation on the original site. Find the queen on her frame, making sure that there aren't any queen cells on that frame, and move that into the new brood box on the original site. Close up the frames around the queen cell and replace the super and the queen excluder. What we've done here is to separate the queen from the brood and the young bees. Now, don't forget that all of the flying bees will have oriented to their original site. So what will ultimately happen is that the flying bees will return to that site, leaving behind your queen cell, your brood, and your young bees on the new site. But of course, on that new site, the bees that are in there will know immediately that they have no queen, and they will build emergency queen cells. That's guaranteed. There absolutely will be some. So you do need to, this is where we need diligence. We do need to go back through that brood box and strip out emergency cells after a week. Thereafter, we can leave that alone for 3 weeks. That colony will requeen itself. Meanwhile, the old queen will carry on to build up the colony on the original site, building up from foundation. Give them a feed, and that will actually help give the bees the resources that they need to draw the foundation. It's a very simple method. It can be done stepwise. It does work. The downside, of course, is that we need an extra footprint in order to make this feasible, and it becomes difficult sometimes to keep the numbers down. We don't all have an infinite amount of space to do this. There's a natty little variation on the Pagden swarm control method called the Hedden variation, which is a simple way of just balancing up the colonies a little bit. And to do this, after a week, we move the requeening colony to the opposite side of the original site. This means that any flying bees returning to find their hive will find it missing, and they'll beg their way into the colony with the artificial swarm. That weakens the queenless colony a little bit further. And also, if more than one queen cell has been left, if we've accidentally not managed to strip out all of those emergency cells, it can discourage a cast swarm by depleting bee numbers in that artificial swarm. Of course, there is the slightly sticky situation that we may not be able to find the queen. Some queens are notoriously difficult to spot, particularly the small dark ones, or some will find that they hide themselves and really don't make themselves evident. So there are a few things that we can do if we can't find the queen, and some people are really just not good at finding queens. The standard tip to look for finding the queens, we have to assume that the queen will always try to find her way into a dark place. Queens don't particularly like being out in the light. We have to assume, of course, that the queen is still in the hive. So if we see queen cells but none are sealed, if there are sealed queen cells in that colony, you might be too late. It might already have issued a swarm. And in that case, searching for the queen is futile. If we want to check out whether we can actually find that queen, this is a technique which is best done on a sunny day in the middle of the afternoon. That's a time when the majority of the foraging force is out. That simply means that there are fewer bees in the colony, and it just makes it easier to have a look through. The less bees there are there, the easier it is to spot an individual bee amongst the melee that's going on the frames. Move the whole hive a few feet to one side, just pop it onto a roof or onto a spare floor, and put a super or something similar or a nucleus colony on the original site. This gives the flyers somewhere to go back to. In the parent colony, you can then take out some of the end frames, the ones that have no brood on, shake the bees off, make sure that the queen's not on those frames, and then arrange the frames in pairs. Now, at this point, you need to step away. Go and get a cup of tea, take 20 minutes, inspect another colony, and in that time, the colony will settle out and the queen, hopefully, will just work her way into one of those pairs of frames. She's more likely to be in one of the dark places. So you can then come back and pick out the frames in pairs. And if you open those frames like the pages of a book, in all likelihood, the queen will be in one of those 4 places that we've got marked with arrows there. She'll be between one of those pairs of frames. It's much easier to find the queen when you know where to look for her, and it helps to do this method. If for yourself and a friend, always helpful to have an extra pair of eyes, and it makes it easier certainly to hold 2 frames and to pull them apart in that way. It does work, but you need to have patience. However, sometimes we just can't find her, can we? And if you still can't find the queen, there are methods that we can use for swarm control without finding the queen. A similar sort of method to the Pagden swarm control. It requires a box of foundation on the site of the colony, and then we'll choose a frame of drawn comb that has plenty of laying space but no queen cells, and put that into the box on the original site. We can then open up a space, and one by one shake every bee from every frame into that space on the original site, apart from one frame with the chosen queen cell. Don't shake the frame with the queen cell, it doesn't do them any good. Just brush the bees off that frame into the new box. In doing this, we shake every bee into that box on the original site. That guarantees that all of the adult bees are in that new box, and that must include the queen. So you know that she's in the box. So you know which box the queen is in. Subsequently, we can drop the remaining frames of foundation back into the gap and just allow those to ease down gently, and the bees will settle out. Add a queen excluder. Put the box containing the brood, the sealed brood and any stores back on the top. Add another queen excluder and any supers, and leave it alone. Leave it alone for 24 hours. In that 24 hours, the nurse bees or the young bees will work their way up through the queen excluder to cover the brood. Meanwhile, the queen is in the lower box. We know that because we shook all those bees into the bottom box, so you know which box she's in. Most of the flying bees will remain in that lower box because they're using the entrance and they're foraging. After 24 hours, you can prepare a new site and simply split the boxes. So you move the box with the queen in it, and the queen cell rather, away from the box with the queen in it. So in simply separating the boxes, we've now got two entities. We've got two known entities. One is a box with a queen and one frame of open comb plus foundation, which is exactly what we would have had we done a standard Pagden swarm control. And on the new site, we've got the frame with the queen cell plus the frames with brood and the young bees. Add a feeder, again 50% sugar syrup, which gives the bees the resources that they will need to draw out those frames of foundation. So what we actually have after this manipulation is the flying bees returning to their original site, because this is where they've oriented to. So a situation much as you would get in a natural swarm, plus the artificial swarm in the new site with a chosen queen cell. Again, this colony, you've rendered it queenless, and they will develop some emergency cells. So you do need to go back after a week and strip out any cells that are not the ones that you want to keep. There will be some, and once that is done, you can leave that alone for 3 weeks to allow the new emerging queen to mate. It sounds easy, doesn't it? In practice, sometimes these things cannot go entirely according to plan. But by stepping through those processes calmly and logically, it should be a good method of making sure that we can control the swarming impulse in our bees. A slightly simpler approach that I use for swarm control in my apiaries. I have about 20 colonies, as I say. I don't want that to double to 40 colonies every year. And so I'll take out a nucleus colony. That means that I don't need a lot of extra space. I don't need a lot of extra footprints. Each nucleus colony, and I use these little polynukes. The nucleus colony that I extract in the swarm control method just sits on top of the parent colony. And so I can tell just by looking at it which of the colonies has had a swarm control done on it. It's cheaper on equipment. I don't need to double up on roofs and brood boxes and stands and so on. It's quite simple to do. It does need to be done carefully if the nuclei are to stay in the same apiary, so that we don't lose all of the bees from the nucleus back into the parent colony. And it's worth noting that a nucleus is a small colony. Mine are 6 frames. Some of them can be 5 frames. They fill up really quickly if they're not tended. And a nucleus which is bursting at the seams can be a swarm issue in itself. And you really do need to be able to find the queen. And we'll say a little bit later on about methods to make the queen a little bit more visible. So this is what I do when I'm taking out a nucleus. Here's my original setup. It's a colony that has queen cells forming. There's an adult queen in there. There are queen cells as well as the usual contents of the box. There are frames of brood. There are frames of stores. I prepare a clean nucleus box that has frames of foundation. I will then set aside the majority of frames from that nucleus and open up a space between the frames, open the parent colony, find the queen on her frame, making sure that there aren't any queen cells on that frame, and I move her into the nucleus. So that's great. I found the queen. I know where she is. She's in the nucleus. She's going to be separated from the parent colony. I add a frame of open brood that has some laying space. The open brood helps to bind that little nucleus colony together. Brood emits a pheromone which has a cohesive effect on the colony. So I make sure that there's open brood and also that there's some laying space for the queen. She's a mature queen. She's in full flow. She's laying. She needs to be able to carry on laying. Then I will take at least 1 and possibly more frames of bees into the nucleus, shaking the bees off each time. And finally, add a frame of stores and backfill any space with foundation. So in the nucleus, I've got a frame of open brood. I've got the frame of brood that has my queen on it. I've got a couple of shakes of bees from other frames in the colony. Plus I've got some foundation. I then close up the parent colony, backfill with foundation, replace the supers, and put a feeder on the nucleus. And the feeder on the nucleus helps to give the bees in that little hive the resources that they need as they now start to establish again and to draw out the foundation. After a week, the same principle applies. The colony with the queen cells forming has had its queen removed. So there will start to be emergency cells growing in that colony. There definitely will be some, and I will go back and I'll strip out emergency cells. Anything other than the one queen cell that I've chosen, which will be on a frame that I've marked with a pin. Just a quick note then on queen cells and emergency cells. What are we looking for in the queen cell that we choose to take that colony forward? Well, ideally, we want an open queen cell. You want to be able to see inside, to be able to see that there is a nice, fat, healthy-looking, C-shaped, pearly white, segmented larva in the bottom of that queen cell, preferably resting on a good, ample pool of royal jelly. When I find that queen cell, the one that I'm going to keep, I will mark the frame that it's on with a drawing pin, so I know which one it is. When I go back a week later, I've not forgotten which frame the queen cell was on. I've not forgotten which queen cell it is, because to be fair, they do all look the same. I don't shake the frame that has got the queen cell on, for fear of dislodging the larva from its pool of royal jelly. If I need to remove the bees from that frame, I will gently brush them just with a soft bee brush. And any other queen cells, any other than the chosen queen cell, I'll destroy those cells so I know exactly what's going on in the colony, leaving the chosen cell on its marked frame. Do look carefully when you're doing this, shaking the bees off the frames if necessary. Sometimes the bees will build sneaky queen cells, and the one that you can see in the picture there to the bottom right, yes, that is in one of my colonies. And I lost a swarm because of this one, because it had crept in there up the side of the comb, up the side of the frame, and I didn't see it. And I only realised there was something wrong when I came to the apiary and my bees were in the hedge. So really, do have a very close look, and it is worth shaking the bees off the frames before you actually say, yes, I've got all of those queen cells, everything's in control. When you close up the colony, if you've got a virgin queen or you know that colony's requeening, don't be tempted to fiddle about with it. Don't be tempted to go in and disturb it. Give it a good 3 weeks. This part of the process needs patience. Sometimes it takes longer than we think. A queen she'll emerge. She needs a few days to harden off. But then we're at the vagaries of the weather. And if the weather isn't brilliant, it can take a number of weeks before that virgin queen will be able to fly out and mate. Sometimes she's very quick. Sometimes she can take 3 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer. So do be patient and don't lose hope if you don't see that there are eggs appearing immediately. If nothing's evident, close up the colony, check again in a week's time. It's only when you get to possibly 4 weeks that you might want to start thinking about making any kind of diagnosis for queenlessness. A few words then about marking and clipping queens. Marking queens, I think the majority of people would agree with. Clipping queens is perhaps a little bit more emotive. I'm an advocate of clipping queens. Well, I'll explain why in a moment. There are a number of commercial devices that we can find, on the market for helping us to mark queens, to pick up queens. Lots of people get a little bit nervous about handling queens. It could go terribly wrong, couldn't it, if we damage the queen? So if you want to pick her up, practice on drones. You don't need to manhandle them, you don't need to clip them, but it does help to practice on them so that you can practice techniques of actually picking a bee off the comb. I pick up my queens by the wings because they're easy to get a hold of that way. I'll then place the queen on the top of an index finger of my non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, I will pick up the queen in my right hand, place her on the index finger of my left hand, and then just allow her to settle while I've still got hold of her, and then smooth my thumb down so that I'm gripping 2 of her legs, at least 2 of her legs. If you only grip one leg, she'll twizz around in a circle, and there's a risk that she will twist her own leg off, and that could cause the queen to be rejected. At this point, I can then release the wings. I've got a good grip of that queen. I can mark her with a dot on the back of the thorax. And while the mark is drying, I'll use that time to clip the queen and then just release her very gently back onto the comb, and make sure that I see her walk away. I use the standard 5-year colour scheme. So this year will be this year is going to be a blue marked queen year, and it will cycle through white, yellow, green, red, and blue. So I can tell by the colour of the mark on my queen's thorax what age she is. I use standard Posca pens, commercially available, actually sold for that purpose. They're water-based, they're non-toxic for bees. They're quite easy to use. You do just need, I think, to be a little bit careful that the ink doesn't splodge, because again, that can cause queen rejection. And I just tend to dab the nib on the end of the frame just to make sure that I've got the ink flowing in the right way before I actually risk putting it anywhere near a queen. I find that the blue is a little bit dark. The green can be a little bit dark as well, so I tend to use a slightly different colour. A pale blue you can also get from Posca, or a slightly limier green, but those are not the ones that we'll see that are sold at the beekeeping suppliers, although sensible, should we say, online suppliers can be quite a good source for these things. I also find that my queens do need remarking, particularly in the spring. And so even though the existing queens are there, I'll do periodically go through and remark them just to freshen up those marks and make sure that my queen is still visible. I do clip my queens. I find that the advantages there are that the bees can't swarm in the same way. The clipping destabilizes the queen's flight, so she's unable to fly any distance. So as the swarm issues, the queen will just fall to the ground. At that point, two things can happen. Either the queen will be lost, so we don't lose the bees, you only lose the queen, and the circling swarm will get a little bit fed up looking for the queen that's not there and will ultimately return to the colony. Alternatively, the queen can climb back into the hive, or more often, she will climb underneath. And so if I've got evidence that a swarm attempt has happened, more often than not, that swarm will be under the floor. And in that case, it's a really easy retrieval, which makes my life as a beekeeper quite a lot more straightforward. The disadvantages of clipping queens, well, there are some. If you're not particularly dexterous, you may find that the queen is damaged. Sometimes the queen can raise a leg as you're trying to go through that clipping process. So you do have to be very careful not to snip a leg off as well as an end of a wing. And that can cause, queen supersedure or queen rejection. Arguably, it's a little bit harder to pick up a clipped queen. That's more really about technique. And some people do have ethical feelings around this, that they wouldn't want to clip a queen because they would consider it to be mutilation. It's very much a personal preference. I have apiaries which are in a semi-urban environment, so from my perspective, I don't really want the risk of swarming because that would be upsetting for my neighbours. So none of us are infallible. If I miss a queen cell, there's a swarm risk. So I want to minimise that swarm risk as much as possible. There is a really interesting article in the Apiarist, I think it was in May 2022 or thereabouts, about queen clipping and whether it's cruel or does it hurt the queen. And so if you have the opportunity, do have a look at that, because it's a very nicely written article that explores some of the issues around queen clipping. As I say, I'm an advocate for lots of reasons, and I find that it makes my life as a beekeeper quite a lot easier. So a final note really just about swarm collection, because that in itself can be a little bit of an art. The principles of swarm retrieval, they centre around some quite key aspects of honeybee behaviour. First of all, if the queen is retrieved, if you're retrieving a swarm and you get the queen in the box, you get the queen in the skep, then the rest will follow because they're attracted to the queen's pheromones. We know from our beekeeping practice that if we want to steer the bees or put them where we want them, they will move away from smoke And we can use that when we're recovering swarms, just to kind of ease the swarm into the place we want it to be. Bees will move upwards instinctively. They don't move downwards very easily, but they will move upwards, and they will move into dark places. They're attracted to the smell of things that they recognize as being home. They recognize as being bee-ish. So they're always going to be attracted to the scent of a colony. And in this case, a piece of drawn comb is really useful. Bees will also instinctively cover a frame of brood, particularly a frame of open brood, and we can use this in swarm retrieval on occasions. Swarms can and do rarely abscond. So if the swarm has already chosen a new nest site, they've made up their mind where they're actually going, then you may find to your best of your ability, you recover a swarm and everything appears to go well. You come back the next day and they've gone. So sometimes we can put a queen excluder under the brood box just to stop a newly hived swarm from absconding. But bear in mind, that swarm may have a virgin queen who will need to get out and mate. So it really is only a temporary measure until the swarm establishes, just a couple of days. And then you need to take that queen excluder out to allow mating. So let's just have a couple of case studies, a few scenarios for swarm collection. This looks like a nice, easy case, doesn't it? It's a swarm hanging in a tree or a shrub. It's quite easily reached without ladders. It's hanging there, really easy. We can pop a skep or a box underneath the swarm, and give the branch a good shake, and the bees will tumble in like liquid. If the queen is retrieved, we get the queen in the box, the rest will follow. It's every beekeeper's dream that we find swarms like this. But unfortunately, the bees are not always that compliant. They're not always in such a straightforward place. What if your swarm just happens to be in a rather dense hedge, a well-established hawthorn hedge, or if it's in an urban setting, it's in a friend's or a neighbour's hedge, and they don't really want that hedge to be pruned for you to make a hole in it. They don't want it to be disfigured. Well, if you can't get a rigid box in, you could try something flexible. I find that those Hessian supermarket carrier bags, the square ones, are absolutely brilliant for collecting swarms, because you can wiggle them into little tight spaces and ease them around the coalesced group of bees. Or you can use a piece of drawn comb, getting the comb as close as possible to the bees. The bees will move upwards to cover the comb. Now, you might need to do it in a few bits, and it takes a little bit of patience, but you can encourage the bees with smoke to cover that comb. Take the comb out into the box, replace it with another comb, and you might need to be able to get the swarm out in sections, but it does work. And if you've got the case where it's a really well-established hedge, this works very well. I'm sure we've all at some point seen a swarm up a gatepost. Makes it a little bit tricky, doesn't it? Just to brush the swarm off or into a box or something. And particularly if it's actually close to somewhere where you don't really want to have a lot of bees in the air. Let's say it's near a car park, or it's near a children's playground. So what I do in this kind of situation is to perch a box or perch a skep on top of the post, on top of the swarm, and then just with a little bit of smoke underneath, encourage the bees gently to climb up into that dark space. Again, it's a technique that requires a little bit of patience, but it is feasible and it does work quite well. Occasionally, we might see what we call a pancake swarm, a swarm that has settled on the ground. And this is particularly the case here. If you've got a clipped queen who's fallen to the ground, the bees may settle around her. This is actually quite straightforward. If you place a comb over the bees, they'll climb onto that comb, or indeed you could just place a brood box, perhaps on some stones or a bit of timber, so it's suspended above that swarm, and they will very readily climb up into the dark, particularly if there's a drawn comb in there. I should add that, in the use of drawn combs in swarm collection, just by way of good hygiene practice, we should make sure that those combs are sterilised. This one's a little bit of a nightmare, isn't it? If a swarm settles somewhere like this, it's quite likely to be in a public place, and it can be a little bit difficult. If you can find the queen and put her in a nucleus, and sometimes we can see the queen moving about on the surfaces of the swarm, then the rest will follow. Otherwise, I would suggest that you can give them a little spray with some water or some syrup, which helps the bees to coalesce and discourages them taking flight. And you can brush the swarm gently into a box, or indeed, a flexible sort of a flexible kind of container. Similarly, if bees coalesce onto a wall or something of this sort, particularly if it's above head height, that can be a little bit tricky. But they will sometimes find their way into if you give them a box that contains some drawn comb, whether it's a cardboard box, a polynuc, or something of that sort. Just in terms of safety, we should always make sure that we've got somewhere firm to stand, any ladders are secured, and so on. It's quite easy in this situation to bring up a nucleus underneath a swarm which is on a wall, and to literally just sort of scrape them in with a very thin piece of card, and the bees will all tumble in en masse. And it does work quite well. You need to be gentle to make sure that none of the bees are harmed, particularly the queen. Sometimes we do need to get a little bit more creative. Not everybody has a cherry picker to be able to collect a swarm, although to be fair, I have seen it done. The device that you can see in the middle is one of my swarm collections. It's basically a bucket on a stick, a bucket on a pole, on an expanding decorator's pole. And that's enabled me to collect swarms from quite high up in trees by standing firmly on the ground, not taking any risks with ladders or having to stand on anything. And that works very well. The issue of bait hives, of course, an attractive new home, setting up a des res for incoming swarms. There are a number of things that we can do to attract bees into bait hives. I use bait hives around my apiary because I think it's a responsible thing to do. I'm not necessarily trying to pull in swarms from other places, but I am providing a safe haven. I'm providing a refuge in case inadvertently any bees swarm from one of my own colonies. If you look at Tom Seeley's work in Honeybee Democracy, a lot of his research focused on the ideal properties of a nest site for the bees. He did experiments with artificial nest boxes and demonstrated that scout bees will really carefully evaluate potential sites based on quite a lot of different parameters before they make a truly collective and democratic decision about which of those sites they're going to choose as their nest site. They look for a volume of about 40 litres. That's about the size of a 14 by 12 brood box. It's a little bit bigger than a national. They look for a small entrance, typically a few square centimetres, about an inch across. Assuming that it's round, but it really doesn't make that much difference. But a small entrance is preferred, and a single entrance at the bottom of the cavity, rather than an entrance at the top of the cavity, in the middle of the cavity, or indeed multiple entrances. Now, ideally, the bees prefer their prospective nest site to be quite high up, about 5 meters above ground was found to be the preferred height. That's a little bit impractical, isn't it? As beekeepers, that makes it kind of difficult for us. I have used bait hives that have been on top of flat roofs and so on, but you really do need to be on the ball and get them down fairly swiftly. And I wouldn't recommend it in practical terms. So my bait hives are always at a good and a safe working height. The type of cavity is immaterial. It really doesn't matter. Dry cavities and well-insulated cavities are preferred, but the bees will actually line any cavity with propolis anyway, and they'll tailor it to be as they want it to be. But they do prefer dark spaces, they prefer enclosed spaces, and so make sure that you're not giving them old and leaky boxes. An attractive nest site needs to be something which has good structural integrity. But a few notes really on swarm collection hygiene. If you are bringing in swarms from elsewhere, so you're bringing in swarms, you don't know the provenance of that swarm, you're collecting foreign swarms, so to speak, Make sure that they're provided with clean equipment, that the equipment is sterilised. Make sure they're provided with clean foundation, or that any drawn comb you use has been sterilised with acetic acid. Think about where you're going to put those swarms. Do you want a swarm of unknown provenance that may actually be carrying disease to be around your existing apiary? Because that could put under threat your existing bees. So consider a quarantine site or an isolation apiary. And when you hive a swarm, allow at least 2 brood cycles before you think about actually bringing that swarm into contact with any other bees. You need to be able to check for notifiable brood diseases, so European foul brood and American foul brood. And last but not least, we know when we want to look after the bees, we want to feed them. But give them 24, 48 hours before you provide any feed. A swarm, as we know, comes with quite a lot of resources. The bees have gorged on honey before they take flight. Allowing them to use those residual stores to actually start to build the comb will mean that any pathogens are incorporated into the comb, and it presents less of a disease risk to either the swarm itself or to the bees that are in the existing apiary. And I think we all know, don't we, never, ever, ever feed honey, only ever sugar syrup that you've made yourself, or a proprietary bee feed, such as ambrosia or something similar. So there's quite a lot of good hygiene practices that we just need to keep at the front of our minds if we are collecting swarms and bringing them in from elsewhere. So just a few closing thoughts, really. I spent many years being, I suppose, afraid that my bees might swarm, but actually don't be. I would celebrate the fact that your bees are making swarm preparations, because it shows that the colonies are robust, the colonies are healthy and thriving. As beekeepers, we can look for the signs. So hopefully, we can stay on top of the game. We can actually preempt those swarm preparations. But even if you find those things difficult to spot, you find it difficult to spot queen cells and so on, be prepared. Make sure that you've got spare equipment. Make sure that you've got frames of foundation. Make sure that the equipment is handy and that you can get a hold of it quickly if you need to. Have a think about marking and clipping your queens. It can make life easier, but it is a very personal thing. And consider a bait hive. But equally, if you're going to do that, then make sure that there is a place for it and a swarm to come in. Consider an isolation apiary, and make sure that you follow appropriate hygiene practices. There's a little bit of light bedtime reading out there, for anybody that wants more information about swarming, because it's a biggie for beekeepers. And these are some of the books that I found quite useful, particularly when I first started. I found the BBKA special issue series on swarming really useful. It's a nice short guide. It talks beekeepers through different aspects of swarming, signs to look for, different methods of swarm control. There's a couple of nice short works by Wally Shaw. He's written extensively in this area, an apiary guide to swarm control, and another small book called There Are Queen Cells in My Hive, What Should I Do? And I'm sure that's a thought that we've all had somewhere along the line. And he's very knowledgeable, and these books are written in a very straightforward and very accessible way. Snellgrove's work on swarm control summarises some more complicated methods that might be, for those with a little bit more experience, a bit more practice. I think this one polarises opinion. The methodology is okay if you've got quite a bit of time to spare, and if your colony is in your back garden. So I would say, by all means, have a look and read it. It's a seminal work about swarming and swarm control and management. And it's certainly worth knowing in order just to have that background knowledge. And any talk of swarming and swarm preparations absolutely wouldn't be complete without a nod to Tom Seeley's work, Honeybee Democracy. Really highly recommended. It's a very clearly written piece. It's informative, and it gives a really good account of Seeley's research on the behaviour of swarms, how they issue and find and rehome, and the truly democratic decision-making process that goes on with a swarm as it issues and searches for a new home. So certainly a few interesting bits of light bedtime reading, if anybody would like a bit more information. And similarly, if anyone has any questions, I know that Diane has said she's going to moderate some queries. So please do fire away, and we can take some questions for a few minutes.
Thank you, Lesley. That was absolutely brilliant.
Would you like me
Um,
to stop my screen share?
yes, that's probably a good idea.
Okay, there we go.
There we
Hopefully
go.
you can see me as well now.
Yes, thank you. You've got a few questions in here. There were lots of people who've struggled to see all of your slides because of something Zoom's doing. But as we've recorded it,
Yes.
it will be available to play again on catch up.
Yeah, it
Um,
absolutely will. Yeah.
yeah. I just want to say Leslie's actually got a book out. It isn't about swarming. It's called Where Do the Bees Go? Highly recommended. Um, so we'll do some swarm questions now.
Yeah.
Um, Keith asks, he runs double brood boxes, and
Yes.
any tips as to moving frames and bees with eggs in each box, and then could he move one box off and add a replacement box?
Absolutely. In fact, double brood, I think, is quite a nice way of running your bees if you're running standard nationals, because you can do those splits really easily. You immediately take the queen away when you lift the box that she's in. You just need to make sure, of course, that there aren't any queen cells in the box that contains the queen. Um, and so you separate the queen and flying bees and so on versus the one that you might leave behind, say the split, which would contain a chosen queen cell in much the same way. Bear in mind that the colony that you leave behind, the half of the double brood that you leave behind without the queen, will raise emergency cells. And so again, we still need to make sure that there's that level of diligence in stripping out spare queen cells. Lots of beekeepers that I know run double brood because it makes the whole swarm control issue quite a lot more straightforward. You don't necessarily have to go through each colony looking for the queen. All you need to do, if you're not sure where she is pop a queen excluder between the boxes for a short time and then go back in 3 days and have a look. Whichever one of those boxes has got eggs in, that's the box that's got your queen in. And so it's quite a simple mechanism. I don't do it. I run 1412s, and double brood on 1412s might get a little bit challenging. A little bit difficult with the size of the boxes, but absolutely it does make swarm control quite straightforward.
Lovely, thank you. You mentioned the Pagden method, but not the DeMarie method of splitting. Was there a
Yes,
reason?
there is. I think I don't particularly like Demery. I've seen it fail a number of times with an issue of a swarm from the bottom box, because I think the principle of Demery is that you add additional space, additional supers between the queen, who will be in a box at the top, and the queen cell and the brood and so on in a box at the bottom. But quite often, if you've got if your queen is not a particularly young queen and isn't particularly pheromony, the bees at the bottom don't necessarily know that, they will know that there's a queen in there. And as a consequence, they'll still issue a swarm from the bottom box. There are people who swear by it, and if you are running just one or two colonies and they are, they're close and you can tend them, some people find that it works for them. I've never found that it works for me. I think unless it's tended quite carefully, it can be inherently flawed. Um, Again, it's a very personal view. I like to keep things simple, and to my mind, that's not particularly simple. And as I say again, I run 1412s, so the boxes are quite high to start with. There might be 2 or 3 supers in between, and then a brood box, which is also going to have quite a lot of stores in it on the top, which I'm lifting above head height. And so it becomes logistically, it becomes a little bit difficult. And beekeeping for me is a solitary pursuit. So I don't really want to have to take a friend with me all around my apiaries because I've got these great towers of brood boxes. And I think I said my method of choice is to take a nucleus out because it's more cost effective in terms of equipment. It's actually easier to do for me. There's not too much lifting. It works, and it works without fail. I've got a system. I've got a process, and I'll stick to it. Each method, different people will like and will stick to different methods. You need to find what is the right method for you. And when you find something that works, stick to it. What I wouldn't recommend is having lots of different methods and trying this and trying that and trying the other and so on, in lots of different ways, because it just becomes complicated. It's expensive in terms of equipment. Keep it simple, and you might not go far wrong.
Lovely, thank you. How far away does an isolation apiary need to be?
Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, we know that our bees will fly 3 miles, so ideally it should be 3 miles from any nearby apiaries. But in practical terms, that's really not going to be the case. So I keep an isolation apiary far enough away that I'm not going to have any drifting along colonies. So I'm certainly not going to put a hive swarm integral to my existing apiary. If I hive a swarm, I bring it home to my garden. I've got an apiary across the road. I just need to make sure that I'm not allowing any robbing, so keeping on top of the integrity of my equipment. But I cut out the opportunity for drifting, for bees to be kind of just inadvertently finding their way into the wrong colonies, and that works. I don't ever integrate a swarm with my existing apiary until it's been through several brood cycles, and I know, I'm content that there aren't any pathogens. There are no disease issues with that swarm, and I certainly don't have any notifiable disease. And I would certainly say, if anybody is ever unsure about whether or not there is a foul brood risk, do have a look at the bee-based website, the NBU website. And if you find that you've got brood in one of your colonies that looks at all suspicious, then do give your bee inspector a call, because they'd be more than happy to help.
Yes, excellent. David's asked a question: what do you think about feral swarms being valuable sources of bees which may have developed hygienic behaviour to control varroa?
Quite possible. We don't know, do we? Because we can't actually monitor the behaviour of those bees. Yes, they have not been treated for varroa, but equally we don't know what the longevity of those feral colonies is. Sometimes we hear of cavities that have been occupied by feral colonies for a long time, but it's very difficult to say whether that's the same colony which has been there for a period of many, many years, or whether or not a colony's died out and the cavity has been reoccupied by an incoming swarm. We know that bees find attractive cavities which have already been occupied. They already smell bee-ish, and they're recognised good sites. So it's difficult to say.
Thank you. We've got a novice beekeeper asking, they have a new hive. On inspection this week, it was noticed they have a few drone cells. When should they recheck the hive?
I would be doing weekly inspections at this time of year. If there are drone cells, if it's only a few, it's certainly not a case for concern at all. It shows that the colony is growing in strength, and the fact that it's now started to bring on drones suggests that colony's doing well. They certainly won't be bringing drones on if the colony doesn't have the strength and the resources to support those drones. So just keep an eye on it. Have a look weekly, and just in a couple of weeks' time, start to look perhaps a little bit more carefully for queen cells. But no, I think that's the fact that there are drone cells appearing there is a really good sign.
Lovely. Tim asks, by using the nuke method, do you find the time taken for the colony to raise a new queen leads to a real dip in numbers and a lower honey harvest?
No, I don't actually. I don't find that there's a dip in my honey harvest because I'm not splitting my colonies. So I use small nukes. I'll just take out a couple of combs and a couple of shakes of bees. I keep them in the same apiary where they've come from. So quite a lot of the flying bees will actually drift back into the parent colony. And I keep the nuclei small, and I keep the parent colony large. And in doing so, I retain the foraging force in the parent colony. And if there's open brood in there, they will carry on foraging. Sometimes it might take 3 weeks for the new queen to emerge, to go out mating and so on. But in the meantime, I've got the nucleus developing. I know the provenance of both of those colonies, and will swap frames between them to keep the foraging force up in the parent colony and keep the nucleus small. So I'm managing both of those to control the swarming, to control the colony size. So I find that it actually works quite well for me. As I say, though, you do have to keep an eye on those nukes because they can grow very quickly. You know, and then you've got an overcrowded nucleus that in itself is a swarming risk.
Yeah. And another new beekeeper asks, how do you destroy queen cells?
I literally just pinch them out of the frame, or just fish them out with the end of my hive tool.
Right, excellent.
Bear in mind, I'm wearing thin nitrile gloves. I wouldn't recommend pinching them out if you're wearing thick gloves. I wouldn't recommend wearing thick gloves because you're just not dexterous enough. But I will always, if I'm choosing a queen cell to go forward for the next generation, I make sure that it's a queen cell it's not completely surrounded by other queen cells. It's close to some worker brood. It's easy to single out. So there's not going to be an issue with my trying to destroy other queen cells around it, and so compromising the integrity of my chosen cell. But yeah, just pinch them out with your fingertips, or just with the end of a hive tool.
Thank you. And Colin asks, what are the consequences of leaving, say, 3 or 4 capped queen cells in the hive? Did I hear something about the first queen to emerge will kill the others?
Well, in theory, that can happen. In practice, my experience is that it tends not to. And as soon as the first virgin emerges, give her a couple of days, and that colony will emit a cast swarm. So that'll be a slightly smaller swarm, which will be headed up by a virgin queen. I've seen some colonies with a propensity for swarming and for doing this will practically swarm themselves out of existence. And meanwhile, the beekeeper is scrabbling round trying to find extra equipment to hive all of these little swarms. So no, I'm very much of the opinion that I'll leave behind a single queen cell. Bearing in mind, using the nucleus method, I've still got my parent queen. So if all else fails, I can just reunite that colony, and I'm back to the parent. I'm back to the parent queen. I'm back to a good sized colony, and nothing's lost. So I don't take risks with multiple queen cells. I think it's yeah, the chances of a cast swarm happening are pretty high.
Right, thank you. James says, when do you find is the earliest versus the best time to do a split for the bees to raise their own queen?
The bees will tell you when they're going to raise their own queen. If the bees aren't ready, then you won't see any of those preparatory signs. Certainly not before there's any drone comb, for example. I keep a strong eye on my colonies probably from the last week of April through to the end of June. Now I'm in Cheshire. For people who are in the south of the country and it's a little bit warmer, that might be a bit earlier for you. And this year things do seem to have been quite a lot earlier. If I see a single queen cell in a colony at this time of year, I'm certainly not going to think, single queen cell, it must be supersedure. Absolutely not. I will assume, during May and June, I will always assume that it's going to be a swarming impulse, and I will manage the colonies accordingly.
Right, lovely. Thank you so much, Lesley. I think I've got to the end of the questions. Thank you so much for this evening. That was a really, really clear presentation. Your slides are beautiful.
Thank you very much.
And those people who haven't caught it all this time can watch it again. It'll go live possibly tomorrow or the next day.
Excuse me, can I just ask a question, a quick question, please? It's Matt here.
Hello, Matt. Yes, go on, fire away. You can have a quick one.
Quick one. It's basically if I use the nuke method, which I prefer to do for catching a swarm, how long should I wait before I unite? Because I have a space problem.
So are you saying catching a swarm which isn't from your own apiary?
No. I basically catch a queen cell. So I do the nuke method, take the queen out, put it in a nuke, a couple of frames, then shut it up, leave it. But I'd like to, at the end, probably dispatch the new queen if I can find her, and reunite the nuke with the existing colony.
So you don't dispatch the old queen, you dispatch the new queen.
Well, then I like the old queen.
But they don't last forever, of course. If you think
if
you think about the queen pheromone argument, there's a good reason to be keeping a young and fertile queen at the head of the colony. I would say, wait until the new colony has requeened itself and you can see that she's laying worker brood. So don't do it as soon as you see eggs, because they may not be worker eggs. But as long as you can see that she's laying worker brood, then it's very much your choice. I would advocate perhaps retiring the older queen to a nucleus and requeening your colony with the new queen and let her take it forward.
Very logical.
Yeah.
In my experience, I have found that queens that have been raised from an egg in my colony tend to have a propensity to give an aggressive hive.
I can't say I've found that. I try to raise queens from naturally occurring queen cells rather than grafts and so on. There is research evidence to support the fact that that eggs which are laid when the bees always intend for them to become queens rather than the ones that the beekeeper intends to become queens, the eggs are bigger. And we know, don't we, that they're going to be always better nourished and so on. And so arguably the quality of the queens might be higher. So I tend to use naturally occurring queen cells rather than grafting. Not always, but most of the time. But I would certainly advocate keeping young queens to head up your colonies rather than, although that said, I've got some favourites too. I've got some queens who've been into their 3rd and their 4th years, and I can't quite bring myself to bump them off because they're like old favourites. And so I retire them to a nucleus and sometimes use them as breeder queens because they may have qualities that I particularly like. But I can't say that I've found there being an issue with poor temperament in newly raised queens. It might be the case. I mean, somebody around you may have grumpy drones. Don't forget you've only got control over half the gene pool. So, but those are things that a lot of the time are out with our control.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right. I think that's definitely it now, Lesley. Thank you so much for a lovely evening.
You're welcome, Diane.
Pleasure.
And thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming along. It's nice to see you all.
Right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. Excellent evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.